Okay, folks, I think we are live now. So, welcome back. Welcome back to the YR seminar series. We are starting back here with a series of webinars every Thursday at 6 p.m. UTC. So today we have our first speaker is John Blischak Blischak, I'll try that again, who's demonstrating his workflowr package. So that is reproducible research with workflowr. With me also, I have my colleagues Marcin and Lais. I'll just give them a moment there to just give a quick hi there. And I think I'll just hand over to Marcin there just to sort of start us. Marcin's got an announcement to make there about the conference. So I'll let you hand over there.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Marcin Kosiński. I'm a member of YR Foundation. And one of the purposes of those webinars is to promote YR conference. So as you may know, or you just will get aware in a few seconds, the YR conference in this year is happening remotely, and it's scheduled in next few weeks. So this is a great situation and a moment to register for the conference. And I would just like to present what pieces we will have during those 4 days of networking and lectures. So this year we have 6 great keynotes. With a remote setup, it was actually easier to get a lot of great names for the keynotes for the conference this year. And the timeline for the conference is that we start on Wednesday, the 23rd. Please note that the time zone is UTC +2. We kick off with a keynote by Julia, a text mining keynote that actually starts the hackathon that will be devoted to text mining analysis. The full Thursday is planned for the hackathon, and we have a sponsored talk from our gold sponsor, McKinsey & Company. On Friday, we have parallel sessions of morning workshops and afternoon workshops. There's also a great recruiting panel by McKinsey, and they will present what lessons they've learned from 500 data science interviews. And on Saturday and Sunday, we will have a chance to hear our speakers and to have a chance to also listen to our lecturers. And if you haven't yet had a chance, you can go to our website where there's a link for the detailed plan for the workshops. And that's really important because the number of seats is limited. So who registers first gets the seat. Yeah, and the first announcement, the text mining is the hackathon will be a text mining hackathon this year. So that's the first announcement regarding the hackathon, and stay tuned for more news about the hackathon and possible challenges and prizes that we planned for you this year. That's all from me, and now I'm passing the mic to John, and good luck and have fun.
Thank you, Marcin, and thank you, Lais and Kevin as well for the invitation to speak with you all today, and thank you all for being here. Give me a second to full screen. All right. So yeah, excited to be here today to talk about my package workflowr. And the slides, if you want to look at them, they're at this short link here, bit.ly y-r-workflowr. And so I'm going to tell you about how you can use workflowr to organize, version, and share your data analysis projects. So first, a bit about me. So my name is John Blischak. I'm currently a freelance scientific software developer. My background is in genetics. I got my PhD at University of Chicago. Currently, I'm based out of Akron, Ohio, which is near Cleveland. And you can learn more about me at my website. And real quick at the beginning, I want to plug, I'm a co-organizer of an upcoming virtual conference on November 14th. It's Saturday, Columbus. It's going to be a one-day virtual conference over Zoom where we feature users from all across Ohio. And so registration opens on September 19th. So if you follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn or anything, I'll be advertising this a bunch. And you can go to the website to learn more details. We'll have the schedule up soon, maybe in a week. Okay, so I'm talking about reproducibility. So first I want to get out of the way is what do I mean by reproducibility? So I've called this slide a definition of reproducibility because everyone has their own definition. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm referring to what another person is able to run the same code on the same data to achieve the same result. And most likely that person is you in 6 months, and that past you doesn't respond to email. So this is really important minimum bar of reproducibility. And sometimes I get the question about other issues. So it's important to note that no software tool will save you from a poorly designed study. So workflowr can't deal with issues about underpowered studies or sampling biases or that sort of thing. This is all about being able to rerun the code that you've written on the data that you've collected. And frustratingly, even in 2020, this is actually still surprisingly hard, this minimum bar of reproducibility, just trying to take a published study and get their data and their code and rerun it. So this was a really recent paper on, it uses ecology papers as an example, but it's similar across fields, where they collected a bunch of hundreds of, like 300 odd papers, and they try to see, does it have code? Does it have available data? This sort of thing. So almost 3/4 had no code whatsoever. Oh, and important to know that they purposely looked at journals where they either required or strongly suggested that code and data be deposited upon publication. So even in journals such as this, still 3/4 had no code. And so only about 20% did they provide code and data. And then of that, about 20%, 1/4 of that was using non-free software, almost a little over half, the data was incomplete, and about half, which versions of the software that they used to do the anti-analysis was not reported. So what this means, it would be very, very hard to reproduce these studies. And what's frustrating is that this is not a new topic. This has been talked about for a long time, even back in the 1990s. So this is a famous quote from John Claerbout about how the scientific study or the report or whatever you produce, that's just the advertising of the scholarship. There's nothing to build on. It's just a PDF. You can't build a research program off of that. That's just advertising what you did. The real scholarship is the code and the data that people can then rerun themselves, extend, and test and verify. And a big difference, I feel, between now and the 1990s, well, there's lots of difference, but as far as reproducibility goes, there are so many great tools, so many great open source tools. And a real nice review is from Lowndes et al. 2017, where they talk about their group of ocean scientists, and they were doing these big data collections and building this big report each year. And so what they did is share their sort of story about, as they adopted tools like R, Markdown, Git and GitHub, these sorts of things, how much easier, so that's the easy was to collaborate, so that's the x-axis on this hypothetical sort of chart, and then easier reproducibility on the y-axis. So as they adopted these tools, it's really useful tools, it became easier to reproduce, easier to collaborate. And so I first got introduced to this during my PhD studies. So I was doing a collaborative study where I was working with Po-Yan Tong and Joyce Sisao at the University of Chicago, and we had our code on GitHub, but we were all changing things all the time. It was already hard to keep track of it, what changes each of us had made. And then we'd have our weekly meeting with our PI, Yoav Gilad. And so like right before, maybe the day before, I'd email a report, but that'd instantly become outdated as we'd made last minute changes. And so we'd been emailing last minute updates. And this was really kind of unsustainable, I felt, as all three of us were generating results and trying to email them and keep things up to date. I just got really frustrated with this process. And this sort of led me down exploring these different tools on how you can collaborate, and ultimately led me to developing workflowr. So the rest of this talk is going to be dedicated to explaining what workflowr is. And so it does a lot of different things. So it tries to keep your projects organized, reproducible, versioned, and shareable. And the end result, when you use workflowr, is a website. So these are just screenshots of people who have used workflowr for their research projects and their data analysis projects. That you have this website, then instead of trying to email your colleagues or use Dropbox or Google Drive or something like this, you have a URL that you can give to your colleagues. They can go to that URL and they're always going to be able to see the latest data. So if you push a change 5 minutes before, they'll still see that at the meeting. Okay, but keeping organized, reproducible, version, shareable, it's a lot of different things. And so try and keep everything straight. I was trying to think of an analogy to compare. And one show I've gotten into here during the pandemic is Nailed It. And so if you haven't seen it, it's on Netflix. And the idea is that amateur bakers try to recreate these really complicated series of baking steps. And it's a nice sort of silly show that during the pandemic and quarantine, that you just relax and turn your brain off. And I kind of like it because I'd be the perfect contestant, because I like to bake, but I'm lousy at it. So if you've seen on Twitter, Kelly O'Brien created this cookie cutter for the Our Ladies DC chapter. And so I was like, oh, great, that'd be really fun. So I got it. And as you can see, I'd be a perfect contestant for nailed it, because I'm not so great. So the R's are barely defined, and I tried to put like blue sprinkles on it, but it was totally random how much each one got. It wasn't the best. So yeah, I nailed it. I'd be a great contestant. But the reason I'm telling you about this is because I'm going to use this analogy of baking to think about reproducibility. So think about bakers. They're taking a bunch of raw ingredients. They're coming up with a series of steps, and then they're publishing a recipe that then expected other bakers should be able to follow these steps use the same input, same raw ingredients, follow a series of steps, and get to that published recipe a similar result. And a similar idea with the data analysis project. There's some sort of raw data source. You're going to put it through a series of steps that your scripts are going to run through, and you're going to publish that result, either an academic paper or an internal report or however. But you're expecting that other people, given that raw data and that code, should be able to reproduce and get the same result. So we're going to go back through and go through this organized, reproducible, version shareable using this analogy. It's first organized. So imagine if you're a baker, you're trying to bake. If you have this disorganized, cluttered kitchen, it's going to be really hard to keep track of things and do anything very efficiently. Whereas if you're a nice, clean kitchen where everything's put away, it'll be a lot easier for you and anyone else who's coming into that kitchen to be able to follow instructions and be able to bake and make it reproducible. So there's not some, you don't grab some random thing off of a counter that wasn't supposed to be there, a random ingredient. And so in computing, it's similar, where if you don't think about it and you just throw everything into one directory, it gets really cluttered. So that if you return to it, say 6 months later, you return to the project because you need to make some updates. If you're an academic, maybe you get reviews back 6 months later. You're really not going to want to work on this. And certainly no one else is going to want to work with one directory full of hundreds of files with poor names in it. And it's a better idea to do something where there's sort of hierarchical directory structure, where you have subdirectories where you put source code in one place, data, results, put these in different subdirectories. Keep everything nice so that if you come back to it 6 months later, or you give it to a colleague, say a new grad student inherits it, or a new employee that you're training, they can make sense of it and find out where everything is. So the way workflowr helps with this is it provides a function, workflow start. So you give the name of your new project, and it automatically sets you up to follow these best practices. So it doesn't let you get into the habit of dumping everything into one directory. It immediately adds in README files in all these subdirectories. And so the most critical ones I'll mention are analysis. That's where your R Markdown files are going to go, and we'll talk about that more later. And then the docs subdirectory is where all the website files are going to go. And so basically workflowr handles all of this. You do your analysis in your R Markdown files in the analysis subdirectory, and workflowr handles the rest. Okay, so reproducible. So there's lots of things you can do to make your code more reproducible. So one is, imagine a chef, if they were trying to make an entire cookbook. And as they worked on it together, a group of chefs make this cookbook. They had their instructions in one place. They had their pictures of the results of the food in another, maybe tips and tricks in yet another subdirectory or another files. Whenever you made a change, you'd have to go back and change all three places. And so if another chef came back, another baker came in and said, oh, what's going on with this recipe? And they saw a picture, they'd have to figure out, okay, is this picture from the latest update of the recipe? It would be really hard to figure out. So what you'd rather have is have them all in one place. The picture of whatever the baking result of the recipe was, the instructions and tips and tricks all in one place. So if there's an update, you update the picture right away as you change the instructions. And this idea is like what's called literate programming and computing. So R has great support through this, through the packages knitr and R Markdown. And so it's the same idea. You put in your code and your images and tables and your interpretation of those all in the same place. So that if you make a change to the code and rebuild the output report, everything else gets updated right away. And so there's no confusion when you're looking at a figure, what code created that figure. The code is right there next to it. You know that it couldn't have been created without that code right above it. And so workflowr is essentially built all around R Markdown. So it provides a function called workflow build, What that workflow build does is it looks in the analysis folder for any R Markdown files, converts them to HTML, and puts them in the docs folder. And it's intelligent. It'll check the timestamp. So if you haven't made any changes to the R Markdown file, it won't rebuild it again. That's its default behavior. It's like a make file if you're familiar with GNU make. Another thing important for reproducible code is to use relative instructions. So imagine a baker says, oh, bake the cake in the oven on the 5th rack. Well, that's not a very helpful advice if your oven doesn't have 5 racks. What you really want is a relative instruction. So they could say, oh, bake the oven on the bottom rack. Well, everyone's oven has a bottom rack. That's a clear instruction that will be able to be applied by bakers in no matter their kitchen or their oven setup. And it's the same thing in computing. If you have a data file and you put a full absolute path to that file on your computer, so this example one here is in my Dropbox folder on my Windows machine. If I go and try and run this code on an HPC cluster, or if I give it to a colleague and they try and run it on their Mac or even on their Windows, they're going to have a different username. They might not even have Dropbox. This is going to break. And so what you want to do is give them the project code and then use a relative path. So if they're running the project code in the project, then they say, okay, the file is in data, let's say data subdirectory, and it's called raw.txt. And this will be able to run on any computer I want to run it on, plus any other person that, for example, would be reading my report and want to try and rerun this on their own machine. So workflowr can detect these absolute paths. So we'll get into more what the screenshot you're looking at, but basically at the top of each of your HTML files, workflowr inserts a report, and it's a reproducibility report, and it tells you if there's any issues that it detects. And so one it automatically scans for are these sort of absolute paths. So if you were to use an absolute path in your code, workflowr would flag it. It would show you the absolute path and then suggest to you an alternative option. So for example, here using this one where it's data.data.csv in my project, it suggests that you just use this relative path. Okay, another thing that comes up is dealing with randomness. So for the baking analogy, you can imagine they might say add a dash of salt, which is hardly hard to reproduce. And so you can imagine there's lots of times in computing where you do this. For example, you might want to do some permutations. So you're going to say, give me 100 random numbers sampled from a standard normal distribution. So fortunately for us, for programmers, you can make this reproducible. You can get reproducible randomness by what's called setting the seed. So all these random number generators in R and other programming languages like Python, they have the idea of a seed. So if you set the seed, then it will be reproducibly random. So if you run this on your computer and set seed 1 and then ran rnorm to get 100 random normal variables, you'd get the exact same thing that I got. And I could run this on another machine, etc. And so one nice thing about workflowr is you don't have to try and remember to do this yourself. It will automatically set the seed at the beginning of all your R Markdown files so that if you run it or someone else runs it on their computer, it will always be the same reproducibly random numbers. And if you're sort of somehow to get messed up and not be set, then workflowr would send a warning. So another thing really important to do when you're baking, if you're having a problem, you're not being able to reproduce the recipe, you need to tell them, if you're trying to contact the original authors of the recipe, say, okay, I'm not getting the same result, I can't make it. Well, they're going to ask what types of pots and pans we're using, what are the brand names of the ingredients, what about the expiration dates of any of the ingredients, etc. And in computing, it's the same thing, is that the things can vary by your operating system, which version of R you're using, which version of the R packages. So it's important to keep track of this. Okay, so and the way you can do that with R is with a session information function. So that's going to record the version of R, the operating system, all the packages that were loaded. So if someone sees this, they can say, oh, okay, I have an outdated version of one of these packages, so I need to update to see if I can get the same result. And so what workflowr does is at the end of each one of your R Markdown files, you don't have to add anything. It automatically adds this. Add this little button here. If a person reading it on your website clicks the button, they'll be able to see the session information. So the version of R and everything. So if they're getting a different result, or they want to see how long ago, which version of R you used, etc., they can easily see that. And it records this separately for each one of your analyses. So if you did one analysis on one machine, you did another analysis on another one, or at a different time and with different versions, each one of the separate R Markdown files that gets created into an HTML file will have embedded in it the exact thing that created it. Okay, so it's also important to clean up between cooking sessions. So a baker is going to need to clean the bowls and the spoon and the whisks, throw out any unused ingredients, turn off the stove burners and oven. That way, when they come back the next time, it'll be a clean slate. There's not dirty spoons lying around. There's not unused ingredients that you don't know what exactly is in that mix, etc. And so similar in R is you don't want to save your session. So every time you quit, it'll ask you, oh, do you want to save the workspace image? And you want to get in the habit of saying no, because all that sort of stuff in there, all those variable names and functions and all that sort of stuff, it's just like the unused ingredients and dirty pots and pans for the baker, that it's just going to possibly interfere because someone else in their kitchen or on their R session aren't going to have these variables defined, just lying around. So you want to get in the habit of not saving the workspace image, so that if your code runs, you want to make sure it can run in a clean session, which means everything is defined and it's self-sufficient in that script. And if you use RStudio, you can actually make this as a default by unclicking the box restore.r data into workspace at startup. And you can also save your workspace. So set save workspace to R data on exit never. Then you'll no longer even be prompted to do this. And this is a good way to just quit cold turkey and stop depending on saving your workspace. And what's great about this is it really helps you find errors a lot quicker. If you run a script and it works, but you haven't cleaned out your workspace, it's very likely there's I always you'll run into rename variables. If I renamed a variable, I'd rename it in like half the script, but I forget one or most of the script and forget one place, the code would still run because technically both were still defined. So this catches those sorts of errors right away before someone else tries to reproduce it. And so workflowr actually forces this to happen. Even if you are saved your workspace image, what it does is it always builds all your R Markdown files in their own separate session. So for example, if you run workflow build and say run f1.rmd and f2.rmd, each one of those is going to be run in its own separate R process. So they can't interfere with each other, and anything you've defined within your current R session when you call workflow build will not interfere. So if you have a variable named X in your current R session, even if f1.rmd and f2.rmd also refer to a variable named X, they'll never be interfered with by the one you had in your current R session. And the way workflowr does this is under the hood, it's using the R package call R to call out to these separate isolated R sessions. And this is also similar to if you use RStudio, if you hit on the knit HTML button, when you hit knit, it also does its own separate R process and workflow build. So it's identical. You can use either one. The main advantage of using workflow build is that it can do multiple files right after each other. Whereas with the knit button in RStudio, you have to click one by one each file you want to knit. Okay, and so I've been talking about these. I've shown some screenshots of this, but this was called the workflowr reproducibility report. So this is at the beginning at the top of each HTML file. So it's going to give you a quick summary, but then each one of these checks, it'll be a green check mark if it passed. And if someone say we're reading your website and wanted to learn more about it, they can click on any one of these to learn more information. It'll explain why it's important. But also I've already shown you that if it fails, it'll say why it failed and give you information about how to fix it. So here on the left, an example of a failing report. So it'll have an exclamation point with the surrounded in red. So if you or a user goes to the checks tab, you can see exactly what passed and what didn't pass. So on the left here, it's saying, oh, well, this file was built when the R Markdown file had uncommitted changes. And so we'll talk more about that in the versions section. But what this basically means is that these results were created from a version of the R Markdown file that was never saved, never versioned properly. So you won't know if you grab the R Markdown file, the latest version, if you'll be able to recreate these results because it's not quite sure what version was used to create them. And then the report on the right it passes all the checks. In contrast, our markdown file is up to date. It's saying, oh, okay, the R Markdown file has been versioned, has been committed. So you know the exact version of the R Markdown source file that created the results in this HTML file. And so I just talked about a subset of these. Some of the other ones it checks. It also, if you've used knitr before, you know you can cache your chunks, especially your long running ones or things that load a big data. This is great when you're iteratively developing, but when you produce your final results that you're going to put on your website and then share with colleagues, you don't want to be using the cache because they're not going to have those cached chunks. So to make sure it works, one of the things it checks is the cache. Another thing I wanted to mention too is I talked about how workflow build uses the uses callr to create an empty, make sure it's a new, fresh, empty environment. If you were to not do that, it will catch that in the environment check. It'll say, oh, there was a variable named X that was defined that was here before the code started being run. So you want to rerun without that there. Okay, so we talked about how workflowr helps you stay organized, how you stay reproducible by automating all these reproducibility practices like setting a seed, session information, running in a clean session, these sorts of things. It's hard to keep track of a long list like that. So workflowr just automates it for you so you can follow your analysis. So next, we're talking about how it incorporates version control. So it's important as you make changes to keep a record. So if you're having a bunch of chefs are iteratively developing their recipe, they might make changes, and so they need to be able to communicate these to each other. So for example, the red chef being in March will say, oh, I increased the baking time. And then the blue chef might come along here and say, oh, I replaced butter with margarine. And then again, the red chef comes back and says, oh, I added more sugar, it wasn't sweet enough. So that way, if anyone comes and looks at this recipe, then wants to help improve it or was confused, like, oh, why did they use margarine in this recipe? They can go back and see who made that change and when that change was made. And so the parallel in computing is version control. And so a popular one, there's lots of different version control software options, but a very popular one is Git. And it's the same idea. It's keeping track of this log of every change that anyone made to a code script. And so this is a screenshot on GitHub of one of the R files in our Markdown package, where you can see Yihui has made various changes. And so you can go sort of back by time, see the exact date, see their message that they put, oh, I made this change for this reason. And so you can understand why the code currently looks like it does. And so workflowr it incorporates all the Git for you under the hood. So you don't have to be a Git expert. You never actually have to touch Git at the command line if you don't want to using workflowr. I think it's important is it's R Markdown aware. It understands that the HTML files are the results of the R Markdown. So if you run a command workflow publish and say, okay, here's my results.rmd file in the analysis subdirectory and I want to publish it now. What publishing means is I want to commit the HTML so it'll be on my website. It's going to do 3 steps, and it'll always do these 3 steps. You could try to do them yourself, and that would be fine. The workflowr report would report everything was fine, but it's easy to make mistakes. The report would catch you if you did, and this is just a much more convenient way to do it because it automates it, so it always works this way. So first, it's going to commit all the changes to the source R Markdown file. So you can imagine as you're developing the analysis, you're running workflow build over and over again until it looks how you want. Maybe you're trying to get the plot to look exactly how you want with the right colors and the right aspect ratios. When you're happy with it, you'll do workflow publish. It's going to commit these changes to the R Markdown file to the Git repository. So it's going to have that line in the log, in the record of your changes. After that, once the R Markdown file has been committed and it's versioned, then it's going to rebuild the HTML results file. So this way, you know the exact version of the R Markdown that created the HTML. And inside the reproducibility report, it actually embeds the version of the code of the repository that created it. So that if you have different analyses that you did at different times, so you did one yesterday and one a month ago, you could, and you started seeing weird things. For example, if you tried to run the one from a month ago, you can go back to that old version and see what exactly has changed between those 2 times. Maybe there was an update to the data file that explains why you're getting new results from a month ago. And so then after the HTML file has been freshly built again from the recently versioned R Markdown file, then it'll commit changes to the HTML file. So essentially what workflow publishes is an R Markdown aware version control system to version both the source, the R Markdown file, and the results, the HTML file. So these always keep these in sync. So if someone's looking at an HTML file, they know where it came from. They know the provenance of it. And so if you start using workflowr, it helps keep track of all this for you because it's this extra information on top of Git. If you're familiar with Git, there's a command called git status. Workflow status, what it will do is it'll give it to you for each R Markdown file, it will give you the status as far as workflowr is concerned, because workflowr cares about not only the R Markdown file, but also the corresponding HTML. So it considered a file that has not been committed at all. The R Markdown file has never been committed. That's a scratch file. Because if you deleted that, that's gone forever. An unpublished file is one where the R Markdown has been committed, but you haven't yet committed the HTML. So maybe this is sort of like a draft. So if you can start working on an R Markdown file, and you can even commit it multiple times over days. You don't want to be on the website yet because it's not for public consumption. Then once you're ready to publish it, then when you'll run it with workflow publish, that will commit the HTML as well. And then workflow status is able to detect when it becomes out of date. So when you can make a commit to the R Markdown file, then the HTML file is going to be outdated because it hasn't been updated and committed since that last update. So workflowr via workflow status is able to find these and alert you to it. And so you can get a quick update, you can create a quick summary of which of your R Markdown files need to be republished. Okay, so lastly, shareable. So think about these bakers. They want to share their recipes with everyone, with the rest of the baking community. So an example is allrecipes.com. If you've used that before, it's a way for everyone to share the recipes and to copy them and change them. And so it's the same idea. There's various websites online like GitHub or GitLab. And you can think of these as what these things are is remember that they're distinct from Git. So Git, the software, is what's doing the versioning. So that can be run on your computer, anyone's server. But what GitHub and GitLab have done is sort of added that social. So think about allrecipes.com. They've added this social component where you can host your Git repository there, and then people can see it, they can comment on it, they can file bug reports, that sort of thing. Another nice feature both GitHub and GitLab provide is that they'll do free website hosting. So for example, GitHub service is called GitHub Pages. GitLab has an analogous service called GitLab Pages. And what essentially they'll do is that they will host a website per repository, so per project for you. And that is what workflowr exploits. It enables the sharing. So what it does is it provides, so again, without you having to know any Git, what it's going to do is you can get set up with one command. So all you have to do is enter in your username. So after you create an account, either GitHub and workflow use GitHub or workflow use GitLab, it'll run everything to set that up, get that ready to go. And then every time you make a change to your analysis and run workflow publish, and you're ready to share it online, you'd run workflow git push, which is a wrapper for git push. So if you are familiar with Git and you like using the terminal, you don't have to use workflow git push. You could use git push directly in the terminal, because under the hood, workflowr project is a Git repository. So any Git command that works on the terminal will work on your workflowr project. And so I've told you about in the reproducibility report all the different checks. So one other thing that workflowr really tries to do is show you the benefits of using a version control without you having to become an expert in Git. So what this table is the past versions of all the R Markdown files and all the past versions of the HTML files. And what this GIF is showing here, and it'll cycle back through again. If you go to this past versions tab, if you click on an HTML file, it'll open up in the browser in a new tab. It'll be that exact version of the analysis. So this is all in the browser. So if you were to send this, say, to a colleague and they didn't know anything about Git or R or any of these things, they could click around and see their version from, say, 6 months ago, all from their browser. And so if you click on an R Markdown file, what that'll do is take it to that exact version of the R Markdown file on GitHub. So each one of the files in your website at the top will have this table of past versions. Furthermore, I'm not showing it here, but underneath each one of your figures, it's a similar thing where it'll have links to that version of the figure on GitHub. So let's say one of your collaborators, they want to see the version of a plot you've been making, but they want the version from 6 months ago when you presented at a conference. They don't have to ask you to try and find it, and you don't have to look up on Stack Overflow, oh, how do I go back in my Git? How do I move in Git to go back 6 months to a commit 6 months ago and find my file, right? And you don't have to click around in GitHub a bunch. They don't even have to ask you for it. They can just go to the website, click on the table underneath the figure, find the version they want from the date range, click on it, and they'll have the exact image. Okay, and so with that, we've covered a lot of ground. How workflowr can help you stay organized, reproducible, versioned, and shareable. So I want to get a quick showcase of some example workflowr projects to give you a sense of how this can be used. So the most common use case, the one that I was originally developing this for, was for research projects. So what I'm showing here is an example from Brianna Middleman. And what she did was for her, she was looking at alternative polyadenylation. So if you're a biologist or molecular biologist, you might know what that is. But the idea is she kept all her analyses in a workflowr project, kept them all nice and organized. So if someone came, like one of her PI or colleague or collaborator came to her website, they could see all these different analyses run around. So if one person wants to see the pre-processing, they can go to those. If someone wants to see the QC, they can look at those on those links and see those analyses. And what's really gratifying for me, and one of my big goals through the workflowr project, is that then when she goes and she's published a paper earlier in 2020 about this work, so you can only put so much in a method section of an academic paper, right? There's so many details that are left out. It's really hard just reading from that high level summary what they did. But she provided a link to Zenodo archive, which is a link to her GitHub repository, so that anyone reading this paper who really, really wants to see the details can go through and see exactly what they want to see, and is all the gory details of exactly how I want, and they can try and rerun it themselves. So another common use case that's come up is doing workshops. So any sort of workshop where you're going to teach some sort of computational subject, you want to know that the code runs because you're going to be having all these students. You try and get them to run this code in a couple of days' time. So by using workflowr, you're demonstrating best practices so they can learn about reproducibility. But also, if it runs on your workflowr website and all passes all the checks, then you know that it should be able to be run on your workshop participants' machines as well. So as an example from Anna Cristali, she was teaching about some GIS in a workshop. You'll see it at the top here. This is a previous older version of workflowr. So the workflowr report looks a little different. It doesn't have some of the newer features like this. Back then, it didn't check for the cache. But the same idea. When she sees all those check marks, she has confidence that her workshop participants are going to be able to run this code. And it doesn't have to be limited to workshops. So Sheng Zhu taught a course when he was a postdoc at Stanford. He's at Penn State now. But back when he was teaching Stats 110 at Stanford, he had his whole statistics website all on a workflowr website. And for various reasons. So one is it makes it really easy. It's a website, right? So you can have links to all, he had links to all his exercises and homeworks and that sort of thing. But the same thing, he was demonstrating statistical concepts. So he wanted the code and the plots and tables to be all right there and together. And he also wanted to make sure that if it ran, when his students tried to run the code, it would run as well. So by using workflowr, building the whole website, using the workflowr framework, he knows all that code is continuing to run, and that his students will be able to run it as well. So I've talked about a lot of what workflowr does do for you. I want to talk real quick about some limitations just to keep, just because it tells it can't do everything, nor does it want to. So I talked about how it records the software dependencies. So at the end, it's going to record the session information of that session that was used to create those results. However, it doesn't really manage them. main reason I've been hesitant to do that is I don't want to prescribe what someone uses. So you could use RM, Conda, Docker Singularity, whatever you're using to manage them. You can be confident that workflowr will record whatever you happen to use. So for example, if you were using RM and you knew that you had a specific version of certain R packages and someone tried to reproduce your results and it wasn't working, you could look at their session information on their workflowr website and see, oh, well, you must not be using my RM environment. So can you please use the lock file that I created for RM, activate that, and then try and rerun it and see if you can get the results. And also, it's not great for complex pipelines. If you have tons and tons, like thousands of files to process and that sort of thing, there are a lot of better things better suited for this. workflowr is sort of at the data analysis visualization where you're modeling and doing QC and creating lots of plots and iterating, right? And you want to keep track of that process. You want to version it and share it with people. But if you have some big complex pipeline where you want to process thousands of files through many, many steps, there's dedicated software that works a lot better for that, such as Drake is an R one, but there's also lots of other ones written in different languages with different levels of support and use cases. In practice, when I do a project, I tend to do the initial big pipeline using one of these frameworks, like SnakeMake is the one I have the most experience with. So I'll process all the thousands of files, create the summary files. When it's ready to be used into R and I want to start doing statistical modeling and visualization, that sort of thing, that's when I switch to workflowr, switch to R Markdown, switch to sharing every single time I make an update in my results on my workflowr website. And so I want to encourage you to try out workflowr yourself. We talked a lot of sort of high level of what is happening, but the coolest part is being able to see the website yourself, see you passing the checks. You can try it out in just a couple steps. So install our packages, workflowr, it's on CRAN, you'll get the latest version. You need to create an account. You can choose GitHub or GitLab. I will say that if you want to have a private website, so GitLab is better for that, especially on the free account. If you want to be able to control access to the website, GitLab is what you'll want to use. GitHub for free accounts, you get GitHub Pages is only able to be used for free accounts on public repositories. If you make the repository private, GitHub Pages won't work. If you have a paid account, you can have a GitHub Pages website for your private repository, but the website itself is not access controlled. Anyone can see that if they find it. So if you really have sensitive data, or you're concerned about that, I suggest use GitLab. But of course, I hope that if you are an academic, especially, and you're going to publish your paper, you eventually, when you publish it, you would make it everything public. That's just my little pitch for open science. And then I have a Getting Started Vidjet. This will take you through, run all the steps to get you up and running as quick as possible so you can check it out and see how you like it. Okay, so this was not a solo effort. So I think the PI I sort of developed this with was Matthew Stevens at the University of Chicago, and then my colleague Peter Carbonetto has helped throughout the entire process. So these are my co-authors on workflowr. And so this wouldn't have been happening without support and resources from the University of Chicago, and then the Moore Foundation, a grant to Professor Stevens. And then I've had lots of users and contributors over the years submit bug reports and provide advice and feedback, and especially contributors fixing bugs and adding new features. I've mentioned a few of them, like R Markdown, knitr, callr. Basically, workflowr works in Git, all these sorts of things. Workflowr works because it's able to combine lots of great open source software. So I really appreciate all those developers making such great software. Thank Marcin and Kevin Lais for the invitation and for putting together this series. This is a great, I've been watching some of these webinars as they've been going, and I'm excited for the upcoming conference. It's great that they're putting on all these events for our users, especially helps in this quarantine pandemic period where you can't really get out. It's great to get to interact with other R users. So with that, thanks for listening. We have plenty of time for questions, so I'll stop sharing my screen. Real quick, those are icon attributions for the ones I use from the Noun project. I'll stop sharing. But with that, I will take questions.
Good stuff. Thanks very much for that. Lais, I think I'll hand over to you for leading the questions there.
Yes, perfect. So, well, first of all, thank you very much, John. It was a great introduction to workflowr. We have loads of comments on YouTube saying thank you very much, saying that everyone loved the kitchen analogies. So thank you for that. It was a great touch.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, that's a lot of time to think about baking analogies here in quarantine. Nowhere to go. So.
Oh, so that's a lockdown. That's a lockdown side effect. There is not really a side effect.
Yeah, exactly. But that's where the inspiration came. Yes, I was. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Cool. So I have a few questions here for you then. So let's start with the first one. So how would workflowr work with RStudio's RM package?
How would it work? So all you would what you would need to do is make sure that it's activated, right? And so RM does a pretty good job. It if you're familiar with the .r profile, basically there's already a .r profile from workflowr, but RM also creates one. So you just want to make sure you just have one in there. But if you have that rm.r profile in your project directory, whenever you start R, it should load that. It will load that. So as long as you're using it through that, the RM environment should activate. And so it should just work. And so RM is pretty good about that. So you might need to specifically run the RM, but I think it's activate, right? So if the environment is activated, it should just work. So to give another example, I use Conda a lot, the same thing. If you want to use it workflowr, you just need to make sure that you activate the Conda environment beforehand. And if you want your collaborators or people to do it, you can put that, for example, on your website or on GitHub in the README. Say, okay, to make this easier to reproduce, I have an environment, be it RM, Conda, or Docker, entire Docker container. So give them instructions of how to set that up. But the idea is that then workflowr just runs with that and will record it.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much. And then, so Anna is asking if workflowr also works for SWI files or only for RMD.
Good one. So it's all RMD. And the reason is a lot of those things I'm using sort of NIDAR tricks. For example, remember the table of, all those things I'm inserting into that R markdown file, especially, for example, like for the figures, there's a table. I didn't show it exactly. I just mentioned it. But after each time a figure gets generated, it inserts that table with all its links to GitHub of every single past version ever. That's using NIDAR tricks to do that, right? So I don't know if Sweave even has the idea of a hook that runs every time something happens. But if it did, I'd have to completely re-implement it in that. So right now it just works in R markdown. If a Sweave expert was interested, I'd be totally open to extending it, but I would need some help. Because I heavily rely on NIDAR hook chunks. And if you're not familiar with NIDAR hook chunks, they're awesome. If you ever had the question, can I do something in NIDAR? The answer is always yes. You just have to really get into it, right? So the question is not, can I do it, but is it easy to do it? There are some things that are easy to do that they have arguments for, but if you have something that they didn't, Yihui and other developers haven't thought of, you could probably do it. You just need the time. That's what a lot of workflowr is just hammering away at how could I add this in?
No, cool. So there you go. There is a possibility of collaboration as well. Yeah. So talking about hooks then, someone is asking if there are any plans to integrate workflowr with GitHub Actions.
Yeah, so what I need to do is think about what I could do is have a setup script, because I don't want to be calling it myself, but what we could do is, and if you have opinions on how to set this up, I would happily, again, open an issue. Let's put it together. But yes, you could. What you'd want to do if you wanted to do the workflow publish step on your CI, you could do that. The big thing is how much time do you need to run, right? If all your code runs real fast, then that would make total sense to just rerun it each time on each CI push. But some people's stuff takes a long time to run, which wouldn't be as conducive to a continuous integration build. So if you think it would run within the time that if you're paying for it, then you probably have more time. But if you think it'll run within the free service times, you could definitely set it up so that you do a CI job that runs workflow publish. The reason it's a little complicated because if you run workflow publish and you have to send it back to GitHub, so you have to have personal access tokens and all that sort of stuff, which it's hard for me to advise other people to do because that's involved with security and stuff, right? Like I can't automatically create I might be able to, but I don't want to create personal access tokens for people because that's just, there's security risks there, right? So that's one of the things that probably could be solved best with documentation and maybe a helper script. So I'd love to chat more about that if you want to open an issue, whoever it was that asked that question.
Okay, cool. Then I think you kind of showed this with the use cases on the presentation, but let's go for the question anyway. So is workflowr designed for more interactive programming or more scripting?
So the idea is that at the end of the day, it's got to be a script, right? So one thing I like about R Markdown, especially within R Studio, is that you get that interactive experience. You have your R Markdown file open, and you got your viewer, you got your console, and you got your plots. You're doing all this. You're making sure it looks good. It's interactive, right? And then when you're happy with it, then you either hit the knit button or you run workflow build, right? And that's when it's going to say whether or not it runs or not, right? So if, let's say you've been spending an hour, updating your statistical model and doing plotting and all that sort of stuff, and you want to share it with people, right? Or you want to be done, right? By running the knit button or workflow build, then you're going to see, did it build at all? And then by checking the reproducibility report, you'll see if maybe it ran on this machine, but how likely is it to run on another machine, right? So one thing I love about R just in general is how interactive it is. So that's the sort of the workflow is you're still interactively messing around in the R console, getting things working. But as you do it, what I like to do is write it in R Markdown and do Control Enter or Command Enter if you're on a Mac to send it to the R console. So you can be doing that interactively. And at the end of the day, you want to save. And workflowr will version it and version the HTML, and then you can push that up to GitHub and share with everybody. So it tries to get both. It tries to be interactive, take advantage of R, but at the end of the day, make sure that script is runnable so that other people can run it too.
Yeah, reproducibility. That's the first rule. Very good. And then VM Boston is asking if there is a way to embed Git hash on the image on the image itself, because it's being experimenting with EXIF.
Yeah, so I've seen people do that. Like I've seen people do that where they put like a timestamp of the date. I probably could do that. I'm not sure how annoyed people would be by it, but basically you can get to it right now with workflowr. You can get to it so easily from the table. If you click on the exact version you want, it'll take it there. But I could see if you moved it outside of your workflowr project, it would be harder. So that is possible. People have done it. Whether or not it makes sense to incorporate into workflowr, I'm not sure. So I'll say again, open issue, we can discuss exactly how, because I've read a blog post about somebody doing that. So the question is, does it make sense to put in workflowr or just give you their solution and let you run it for your project? But it is possible.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you. And then Li Huang is asking about RMD files pipelines. So the question is, does workflowr have a function to knit a sequence of RMD files simultaneously? Which means, so file 2.rmd relies on file 1 RMD results. So like knitting those outputs files in only one step.
Yeah, great question. Yes, I need to do that. It does not right now. Right now, it relies on alphanumeric sorting. So if you wanted to do that, you could do O1 dash, O2 dash, that sort of thing. It'll run in that order. But anything more complex than that, it does not do right now. So be on the lookout for workflowr 2.0. I would like to add that in to have some basic dependency management. But currently, no, you'd have to enforce it by the file name using alphanumeric sorting right now.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Then we have a new question now. So we may want the data analysis reports to be viewed internally during the early stage of a project. Could you suggest how to deploy the website to achieve the goal using workflowr?
Yeah, so if you want access control, just use GitLab. It's pretty convenient. So even for a free account, on GitLab, you can say who can access the repository, the source code, and who can access the website. And I think with the GitLab, you can log in with like a Twitter account and Google. You can log in with different things, right? So if like you were sharing it with like your boss and they didn't have a GitLab account, they could, as long as they have some account, they could log in. You could give them access, and then only those people would be able to see it. if you're at a company where they have like a enterprise version of GitLab or GitHub, then of course it's internal and it works fine. workflowr will work. I use it from one of my consulting gigs. I have a enterprise version of GitHub, and workflowr works fine. You can host it. You can see the past version. You can see most of the past versions, not everything, but it works pretty much identically for GitHub Enterprise.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And then, well, I think our questions here, the questions about the talk are done. I would like to remind everyone to join the mailing list for updates. We'll be publishing the link as well. You can get updates of all the new releases of workflowr there. And if you have issues as well, please just make a pull request or send a question to John. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks for that, John, and thanks for that, Louise. Just got a quick question, just in case we'll have a few more questions to come. So we'll just sort of ask one myself. What was life like when you were starting out as a researcher with reproducible research and all that? I mean, before GitHub and GitLab and all that sort of stuff, and Markdown, it must have been terrible.
Yeah, it was terrible. Yeah, so I was lucky. If people have heard of software carpentry, they found me about the right time because I started doing stuff, and as an undergraduate, my text editor was Notepad on Windows. It was awful, as you can imagine. That's no way to code. But yeah, so starting in graduate school, I'm starting to do things that people like, doing homework assignments or whatever. Who cares, right? But I started doing stuff that like people wanted results for, and we're gonna like put in a grant or put in a paper. I started getting nervous, like to have all these like different multiple versions of the file because I didn't want to break anything, right? And so basically I went to a software carpentry workshop, fortunately, early on in my graduate school. I think about the second or third year. But anyway, they taught me about version control. So now there's no more _final, right? There's no more of that. Version control is very freeing, right? You can always move forward because if you break anything or if the results change, you can get back. And so that sort of started me down this journey I've done a lot of teaching of Git and GitHub. I even wrote a paper, like a tutorial on it for PLOS computational biology. It's just really hard because researchers are busy, right? They have experiments, they have their qualifying exams, they're trying to write their papers and review papers and all this sort of stuff, right? So what workflowr tries to do is, understand that they're busy, give them the benefits, give them reproducibility, improve the reproducibility of the entire ecosystem. So make their lives better, make their colleagues' lives better, make open science better with minimal effort on their part. If you know R, Markdown, you can use workflowr and you can focus on your analysis and you get all this other stuff. There's some setup, let's not lie, but for mostly for free.
Good stuff. Thanks for that. Just another quick question, really, just to give a chance for a few more people to ask. You got the Saturdays coming up, and I believe that you're also involved in the local R user groups in Ohio. So just tell us what the R community is like in your part of the world.
Okay, I would say it's not huge. So like I'm a co-organizer of the Cleveland R user group, and we have a dedicated core, and then we get people. So one of the big industries we have in the Cleveland area is Progressive Insurance. So they're a big R shop there. So we get people from Progressive. We also have Case Western University. So we get out academics that use R. And so then I'm collaborating. So the whole Saturdays Columbus came about because I ran into Katie Sasso, who she's a co-organizer of the Our Ladies Columbus there. I ran into her at the last R Studio conference. I was like, we're both R users in Ohio. Let's try and build community here. So that's the sort of goal here is what I've been trying to do is not only within my sort of local region of Ohio, but then grow the whole state. Because we have a decent number of users, but it's not like, it's not like on the coast, right, in a tech hub. So
yeah. Good stuff. Just another quick one, actually. We'll probably end with this. How have you been getting on with lockdown and the new normal? Has that affected your career, or has it changed things much for you?
Well, so I'm remote, so that part hasn't changed. This is my office. This is where I would have been working beforehand. One of the big thing is no more conferences, right? I spend all this time alone in this office. A conference every couple of months is the way I sort of got that out, my energy out, and got to see people and catch up with, past friends and meet new people, right? So I'm doing my best on the Zoom conferences. That's one of the reasons I was motivated to do the Saturdays Columbus, is to try and keep this energy going, because yes, it gets a little isolating here. And then of course it's hard with the little kids, but that's I'm surviving.
Yeah. Good stuff. I think I'll end with this one actually. Just actually for career young researchers, what sort of advice would you have for them? Like particularly people who are new to R, let's say they're coming from natural sciences like life sciences, like genetics and stuff like that. What sort of career advice would you give to them? Somebody who's just about to start a PhD, let's say.
Yeah, what I would say, so I've been thinking about this a little bit. So here's my advice is that, so it's really easy to get caught up in the week to week, like, oh, I want new results each week, right? But especially early on in your career, most of what you're going to be doing is just trying things that don't work. So you want to try and build in a habit of like building up skill sets, right? Like learn a new framework, learn how to do ggplot2, right? Try and build that in during each week as you go on, so that if after a couple of years, you still, you're still sort of flailing and don't have results, which is sort of the grad student life, right? You build up skills that you can try more ideas, right? That's just the thing. You don't want to, basically grad school is all about trying different ideas, right? And so if you make a dedicated habit of picking up, okay, I'm going to learn this package for this, or, oh, I really need to do this type of analysis, so I'm going to learn this bioconductor package while I'm, trying to get my results for this week. I think that'll really sort of have an exponential effect, right? Because as you learn how to learn new R packages and skills, that sort of thing, it'll really start to pay off as you go on. So that would be my advice: is to try and invest in yourself a little bit each week. I know it can seem like there's deadlines looming, there's abstracts due, and there's qualifying exams, but investing in yourself each little week, it'll make each week that much a little better, and you'll be able to get more done each subsequent week.
Good stuff. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there because we've gone over the hour now, actually. So I think this is just a nice spot to finish. I'll finish anyway. I'll hand over to March and Laiz if you want to sort of make any closing comments there.
Well, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much, John, for your presentation. It was lovely. Thank you very much for everyone that showed up and sent your questions. And, well, said thank you to John as well. We have loads of thank yous on YouTube, by the way. And
thank
yes.
Yeah, thanks.
I really appreciate
Thanks very
coming.
much. Yeah. Okay, I think that's it. We'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much to everyone who joined us on YouTube. It's great to see people from all over the world that we've joined us, and I really get a thrill out of that. And hopefully we'll be seeing you as well in the future joining us as a presenter. So always keep that in mind, that we'll be always open for that. So I think we'll leave it there, Martin. We'll call it, well, that's a wrap, as the fella says.
Yeah.